Hello, I am Urmi Desai, editor here at Move Smartly, and I am very happy to be back for our monthly roundtable with our wonderful panel. John Pasalis is with Realosophy here in Toronto. Hi, John.
Hello again.
And Steve Saretsky normally is in Vancouver. He's going to talk to us about the Vancouver markets from the Saretsky Group at Oakwin Realty in Vancouver. But right now, Steve, you are somewhere else.
I'm supporting WeWorks in New York right now. I'm trying to keep the company afloat, and so I've graciously settled my roots down here in the WeWorks.
So let me get this straight. You heard you heard news of the bankruptcy of WeWorks yesterday, and you immediately rushed to New York to look for a place that you could broadcast from.
The first two of three were closed down with locks on the door. So I finally found a WeWorks that is operational, and I got to say, it still looks pretty good.
Nice. All right. Well, and maybe that is a telling lead-in as yet another company related to the real estate sector sees trouble. We're going to get into that, a few more headlines on that front. Let's start, though, with our regular market update in terms of residential real estate and numbers and what you're seeing on the ground. Let's start with Steve. What are you seeing in Vancouver?
I would say like things it's slow. You can kind of look at the data. I don't think the data is really telling us like a whole lot. Like there's nothing that, like, in my opinion, that really stands out as like, oh, like this is 20-year lows in listings. Like if you look at it, like inventory's up a bit. New listings are kind of a little bit more normal. Sales are really low, not quite 20-year lows. But and so I think what you're really seeing is just feet on the ground, is not a lot of selling. And you could even do like a price reduction, and like even with that price reduction, I'm not convinced that you're gonna sell. So it's tough because it's like it feels like there's really like no liquidity. Now you still see, like, so people are always asking, like a lot of clients that are looking at the market, and they're saying, well, it doesn't really feel like prices are coming down that much. And I would agree, because I think what you're seeing is the properties that are selling right now in this tough market are typically like the really good properties, right? So they're, move-in ready, entry-level house. Well, there's still, like, of course, there's still demand for that, and those are still selling relatively well. But then there's a whole bunch of other product that's just like not moving at all. And then like you do a price reduction, you do another price reduction, like there's like not even like offers coming in. So like, so there's a lot of that product that's like not moving at all. And so like if you're just looking at like sold prices, it looks like the sold prices are holding up fairly well because the stuff that's selling is still selling fairly well. And so the rest of the stuff just isn't clearing and isn't filtering through into your average median price, benchmark price, what have you. So those are the important dynamics to kind of like work through.
Okay, and we're back with Steve here. Unfortunately, it looks like liquidation's taking place all around you, and you were forced to move to a new location.
I got booted out of the private room. I didn't pay for it, so I'm stuck in a phone booth right now. So I do apologize for the volume.
How dare you? Just when WeWorks needs every dollar. All right. So you were talking about listings in Vancouver and whether that was part of this story.
Yeah, I think it was a good chart that was going around there at RBC. That is showing like the differences in listings compared in Toronto versus like Vancouver. And I think Vancouver is still quite low. There's still not a ton of inventory. I just think that like the demand is so weak right now that just nothing is seemingly selling. What we are seeing is a lot of sellers now, as we're, early November here, like people are now pulling listings off the market. So that's becoming more common. They say, hey, I've been on the market for 2.5 months. I haven't sold. I'm frustrated. I'm going to take it off the market. I'm going to try again in the spring. And so we'll wait and see what the spring looks like, of course. But I think that's anyone's guess.
All right. And let's move over then, John. The story in Toronto, I think, is a little bit different with some climb in the listings, right?
Yeah, Toronto, I think that the GTA generally is a bit softer than most of the other regions in Canada. So yeah, sales are still insanely low. Listings are typical. They're not like record volume necessarily when we look at sort of total number of listings. But again, if you have like even average number of listings and unbelievably low sales, you're gonna have a soft market and listings are gonna build up. So the trends are pretty much, again, nothing massively different. You know, sales are soft, listings picking up, months of inventory picking up. You know, price is kind of an interesting trend. I'd say that there's definitely was some price decline since the spring. Many of the areas I look at now look somewhat stable-ish. You know what I mean? You know, I'm not seeing tons of downward pressure, but again, this is also very regional. So I have to take this with a grain of salt. Like we've looked at different regions where, you know, average prices are down 10% since the spring of this year. And other regions and other house types where prices aren't really down. You know, I think this is important for sellers, obviously, so you can understand sort of what's causing this slowdown in activity. Like Steve said, like, you know, even if you do a slight price reduction, you're not going to sell overnight. Just the demand is so weak. So, you know, the price changes are quite volatile, I'd say, across the GTA. It depends on the segment and the type of home you're looking at.
And is there a general pattern? Like, are you seeing the areas furthest out from the city core being hit a little bit more in the suburbs, some of which we saw a really big boom in activity through the COVID period and beyond? Is it condos? Is it the condo sector that's really slowing faster?
Yeah, it's hard to point to a specific segment. Like certainly like low-rise houses in the suburbs are getting hit a little bit more. But so are, you know, some areas in downtown Toronto I've seen a bit of a price decline as well. Condos, like in the suburbs, some regions I looked at didn't fall as much as low-rise have. So it really kind of depends. There's no like concrete pattern that I can kind of identify. But certainly it looks like low-rises dipped a little bit more than condos in terms of prices for sure.
And before we move on to maybe what might happen next, I wanted to get a sense from both of you about consumer sentiment. Like, what is the overall feeling amongst buyers, sellers, investors that you're hearing from your clients and those inquiring?
John?
Yeah, I'd start. Sure. I mean, you know, buyers, I'd say these days are very cautious. You know, I find most that are buying just need a home. You know, and the caution's kind of reflected in their prices generally. You know, most, even if house is getting multiple offers or selling for within market value, sometimes even a little bit below market value if there's not a lot of competition. You know, but again, these are buyers who kind of want to buy a home. They need a home. They're not trying to time the market. They know prices might dip a little bit, but you know, if you've been looking for 6 months, you know, and you find a nice home you like, that's kind of what's motivating them. Sellers, it's harder to say. Like, definitely we're seeing some investors wants to sell and unload properties that they've rented. It's hard to track this because even though we have some stats where we can look if someone's an investor based on if they listed for rent on the MLS in the past, a lot of people don't necessarily list on the MLS. You know, some people who have houses that are used as rooming houses or whatever are not. Like some of our investor clients, when, you know, we had listed several investment properties, none of them were listed on the MLS as rentals, right? So we'd have no record of that, but we knew they were like rentals because they're our clients. So definitely some pressure, but even then, it's kind of interesting. Like many of the investors we've kind of talked to, it's, you know, it's kind of like Steve said, they want to sell, they want to deleverage, but if they can't get the price they want, they'll just rent it again, basically, or you know what I mean? So it's a very interesting market. I haven't seen too much like super distress, but definitely you feel the numbers are impacting some people and they're more willing to consider selling and deleveraging.
So presumably the sellers that you are seeing, not necessarily investors, are the flip side of those that have to buy. Maybe some of them are having to sell because they're moving on up due to family changes and whatnot. What is the feeling amongst those sellers? Like things have to be a lot nervier than they used to be in the GTA.
I mean, it is, especially if you need to sell and you need to move on. Like it's very hard to explain to seller clients when they're getting like 3 or 2 showings a week or some weeks with no showings, right? And that's just the market in some regions. Like if you just look at the data, it's a very slow market in some areas. Now, the flip side is like the people who are looking are active. You know what I mean? So like in the past, you've had would have 40 showings on a home. You know what I mean? And you'd sell in a week and you have multiple offers, which is great. Like now you might get like 10 showings and 1 solid offer, right? So, it's, you know, the people who are out there active are serious. So you don't need a ton of activity, but again, it's stressful for a seller when you're not seeing a lot of showings.
And unusual for the GTA.
For sure.
A big change. So Steve, what is the feeling in Vancouver? Is it a little bit more moderated in terms of you're saying prices are kind of holding?
Yeah, prices. I don't know if I'd say prices are holding. It's just like there's just seemingly like a lot of stuff that's not selling. Like the good stuff is still selling. Like I would say for like, if not top dollar, close to it. So there's really not like a lot of discounting, right? Because like again, if a good product comes on, the reality is it sells in a week, right? And it might even still get multiple offers. So there's a whole host of stuff that's not selling, right? So you get a lot of condos, like a more expensive 2-bedroom condo. That a lot of that product's just not moving. We're seeing discounting now on like land values, right? So tear down houses, right? Because again, if you're a builder, you're looking at the market outlook and saying, well, it doesn't really look that good. I got to, tear this house down, rebuild, and then flip it and sell it. And like, what's that market look like? So like, those are typically the bidders for that kind of product. So you're seeing some softness in that sort of product type. But yeah, I would say like in general, I think sellers are still kind of like holding on too, right? Okay, well, I'll do one price reduction, but like they're not really adjusting to the market realities. And this is always kind of the tug of war between buyers and sellers, which is, prices are always sticky on the way down. And we're just kind of waiting for, sellers are obviously waiting for a catalyst and saying, okay, what's the market going to change? Now, again, these things are always hard to predict. I would just caution people that's, I know the initial reaction here on YouTube or whatever is going to be, these people are dumb. Why aren't they selling for low? Next spring is going to be even lower. And okay, totally get it. I get, the outlook isn't great. Totally understand that. But like, I would just caution people that we have this sort of same mindset in 2022, right? Summer, fall of 2022, market's really soft, really weak. Interest rates are actually, higher. Like Bank of Canada was still raising rates in 2023. Like the market went up. The spring market bounced. We saw prices jump 10%. And they're rolling back over again. So it's always hard to sort of say what the market's going to look like 5-6 months from now, right? You could have a temporary relief in the bond market. Rates could come back down a little bit. It's hard to say. I would say in general, though, if sellers want to sell, our advice is to get out in front of it. You have to set the new benchmark. You have to set the new comp, in the building or in the neighborhood, for example.
Steve, you're touching on the next thing that I want to talk about, which is what might happen next. And we already saw, I think since we've spoken, the Bank of Canada held its rate at 5%. The US Fed then followed by holding its rate. And now we're seeing some latest survey numbers, a survey of top financial experts in Canada, suggesting they're expecting to see rate cuts starting in April 2024 next year, and perhaps ending the year at 4%, which would be a 1% drop from where we are now. So I'm wondering just what your overall take is on this. I know that interest rates have had a profound impact on the real estate market. You both have told us that story. So what do you think about what's likely to happen next? I don't know who wants to start first.
Steve?
Okay, well, I'll take this one away just because, John, I actually had a really interesting conversation with I went for dinner with our mutual friend Anthony there, who was actually in town in Vancouver. So we were at a good chat, and I think he's a little bit more, he's a smart guy, right? So obviously he's a bit more skeptical. He's a bit more bearish. Totally get it. Him and I actually see the world in a very similar fashion. And so one of the things he says, well, give me the bull case, just like, let's just play devil's advocate. Give me the bull's case. And I said, okay, well, if I was trying to brainstorm like a bullish thesis, what I would say is probably along the lines of, you get this, I think we're already in a recession, but like, let's say the recession gets a little bit deeper, you get a few more job losses. With that, the bond market likely follows suit. So you get lower yields vis-a-vis lower mortgage rates. So let's just say you get mortgage rates back into the low to mid fours, which is, mid fours is where we were last spring in the market. It was fine. So let's just call it mid fours. I would argue that, again, if it's modest job loss, you're probably looking at the lower end of the job losses in terms of like, what are the incomes being lost, right? So I always go back and look at like COVID. I think COVID showed us that like, okay, we laid off a lot of the sort of lower skilled workforce. And those people weren't buying to begin with. They don't qualify. And then, you know, you look at markets like Vancouver and Toronto, the reality is the markets are so egregiously unaffordable that you have to be basically in the top 30-40% of income brackets to have a chance of ever purchasing real estate, or have lots of help from family. So I think the bullish case is like, okay, hypothetically, if you do get this like miraculous soft landing, a little bit of job loss, a little bit of decline in the bond yields, and the people that lose their jobs, because that's what happens in recession, are not typically the people that are buying houses to begin with. And so we carry on our merry way. Again, I would say the probabilities of that are probably not that high, but I think it's a probability that we have to consider. And so that would be like the bull case. Now, the bear case, of course, is that rates sort of stay at these levels in the sixes. And I think that there's more pain to come, because we're still seeing sellers saying, oh, I'm going to take it off and try again next year. Well, again, if the rates are still the same, and buyers are squeezed on what they can borrow from an 8% stress test, then I think we do have more downwards pressure on prices.
John?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with Steve. I mean, I think it's important to look at the bull and bear case. I do think, I think ultimately the market's just going to be tied to what happens with rates over the next 6 to 12 months. And yeah, if rates stay in the sixes, fixed rates, it's going to be a very, very difficult market. I mean, I think the report you talked about, was economists forecasting Bank of Canada dropping a full percentage point next year, which might be optimistic. I mean, who really knows? I mean, if that's happening, I think the economy is slumping as well. Like the Steve point, we're probably going to see job losses. I think they would probably, if we do see a deeper recession, it's probably not going to just be, low income jobs. I mean, we're already starting to see like banks cutting staff. So all of that can weigh on the market. Now, I think ultimately, I think more than what the Bank of Canada, I mean, the Bank of Canada obviously matters, but how bond yields react, because that's ultimately what's going to drive sort of fixed rates. And I think that's going to be more important than, the Bank of Canada rate. And obviously there's a relationship between those two things. But if the bond market kind of dips faster than the Bank of Canada, then yeah, you could have, 5-year rates, even close to 5% or in the high fours. That would potentially bring some stability. I don't know. That would be maybe like the bullish case is probably like a stable market rather than a ripping market in this.
I was actually going to add that like asterisk next to it, right? It's like, again, mortgage rates down to 4.5. Like, I wouldn't say that's like, oh, it's a bull market. Prices are going to like, rip and we're at the start of a new cycle. I wouldn't make that comment. But I do think, like you said, things stabilize where right now we're seeing a lot of product that goes no bid. Instead of it going no bid, does it sell in 2 weeks at a modest price? Sure, possibly.
Yeah. So yeah, we'll see. I mean, I think we're all just kind of, waiting to see what happens in the markets. We can't really predict it. And like Steve said, I mean, it's tough to advise clients because, he's right. I mean, if you're on Twitter the way we are, everyone, has a crystal ball and knows with certainty that prices are going to tank in the next 2 months and they're going to fall 30%. And if you don't sell now, you're an idiot. I mean, obviously we don't know what's going to happen. People have to make decisions based on their own financial needs. And some people don't need to sell and aren't in a rush to sell. So, we can't advise people when to drop, what price to take, or what's going to happen 6 months from now. But we do have to tell them the probability is, and I do think the most likely scenario is that things are not going to be better 6 months from now. I think that's my position. Like, I don't think you're going to get an extra 50 grand if you sell in March. You know what I mean? Like, we might be at the same place we are, or we might be lower. And I think those are the most likely events. But I said the exact same thing a year ago, and I was completely wrong because prices ripped in 2023. So you don't know, but I suspect that's what's happening.
It's funny though, because everybody wants to know, or everybody wants to, forecast. It's tough, right? I mean, like, obviously you and I are in the market day to day, every day. We're looking at the data. We've built up these software models and platforms of, showing us all the stats, and we can have our opinion, but it's just that, right? It's an opinion. things out of your control can change. And so, like I said, I would agree with you, right? I just, for me personally, at the end of 2022, like I was not expecting, detached house prices to jump $200,000 in the spring of 23. But yeah, they did. And so, these things are, timing it is tough, but I think all you can do is kind of give the best advice you can with the information that you have available, and let those clients make that call, right? I mean, everyone's financial circumstances are different. So you have to sort of take that into account in terms of your advice. So hopefully that helps for people listening.
In either case, the upside, like you were saying, Steve, is really just more kind of trying to work out of a situation, which is whipped up. We're seeing that now on the PreCon sector where the hits are starting to come. So in Toronto, we are seeing headlines. And here's one of buyers pulling out of their pre-construction purchases. A lot of these are homes, detached homes, townhomes in the suburbs of Toronto. People walking away from deposits as high as $300,000. The reason being that when they go to qualify for their mortgage, they can't. And, they can't actually complete the sale or take possession, as they say. And on the heels of those kind of headlines is yet news of another fire in Vaughan happening in a pre-con development. Now, this has now become a bit of a, more than one issue. So there's definitely some questions on that side. On the condo side, on the pre-construction side, a huge development, a landmark one, was supposed to be landmark, the one at Yonge and Bloor, which is supposed to become the tallest tower, I believe, in Canada, at least in Toronto. That project is now fallen into receivership. And another developer, West Bank, we see an article here John just tweeted about, is being sued by 4 construction companies for more than $25 million in unpaid work at the large Mirvish Village rental apartment project in Toronto. And that's another big company also with projects in the US as well. So we are definitely starting to see some real trouble in that sector. I'm wondering what you two think of these headlines and also what it means, because the pre-con construction has been such a big part of the story, especially in the GTA when it comes to the housing boom.
Yeah, these are, red flags we've been seeing for some time. In 2 different segments. Low rise, the people who can't close, a lot of this is, you're right, they can't get a mortgage. In some cases, the home isn't worth what they paid for it, so they just have to walk away. We're seeing tons of distress. We've been seeing, as you indicated, these fires recently in Vaughan, this has become, I'd say, a relatively common trend over the past 12 months of new low-rise housing developments just going up in flames. And obviously it's hard to explain it. Obviously the concerns are it's arson, and who might be behind it is anyone's guess, but it seems like it's too frequent for it to just be an accident, because there's quite a few developments that have been in that situation. And then the pre-con condo space, the one is a project I think many people in the industry have been worried about for some time. It's had a lot of problems. The developer, honestly, before he built that, or started to build that project, they'd only kind of built 2 low-rise projects that are like, I think 8 stories. So, he decided to go from building, small, low-rise projects to the tallest tower in Canada. You're going to have some hiccups, obviously, because there's a steep learning curve. So not surprising. I think the West Bank one is a little bit more surprising to see those headlines. It's generally, a bit of a red flag when you see that in the news. Especially with the economy slowing, to see developers not paying their bills. And I think it's, getting sued by other suppliers who are also big companies in some cases. So these are not good signs, for the market, for the economy as we're moving forward. And I think it's just a good indication. It just shows us that, again, I think the companies that are probably going to get hit the hardest are going to be this, and the same as in the housing market, the ones that are the most leveraged, that took on the most debt, that stretched the most to maximize their profits, are feeling the impact of higher rates, and it's impacting their numbers. And I would not be surprised if that's a big part of it.
And we see from our other segment, the situation, a lot of buyers of these pre-con projects that are in that bucket. Maybe we're almost the latest to get in, emailing you, calling you, panicked because they now have to come to close and they're having a lot of problems. My sense is this is one of the weakest sectors for buyers, for distress, the potential for distress. Is that your sense, John?
Well, the challenge is, I mean, it's the weakest sector because you can't market usually pre-construction properties because you haven't taken possession. The builder doesn't allow you to market. So you can't advertise it. It's not very liquid because you can't advertise it. There aren't a ton of buyers. You have to look at them on private, Facebook groups or WhatsApp groups or whatever. So it's very hard to sell them. Little motivation from buyers to take on the risk. There's very little price transparency. You know what I mean? At least with low-rise homes, you can look at what the neighbor's house sold for down the street to get an idea of what the good value is. So you don't have that with pre-con. You can't even see the home. You don't have as much information. So it's a bit harder to sell those. So yeah, they're having a very hard time.
Is pre-con, Stephen, distress related around that as big a story in Vancouver?
It's funny. We don't really have buildings going up in flames, John. I don't know. That's got to be a Toronto thing.
It is, yeah.
It's pretty unusual. I think we haven't really seen much stress in the pre-con space. I mean, like I said, I still think just because we haven't seen stress doesn't mean we're not seeing losses. I just think there's a lot of pre-sale I think the pre-sale buyer that has done tremendously well, let's say over the last 10 years in general, I think is going to underperform over the next 10 years. Now, I think where you're going to see most of the losses in the pre-sale side is you bought a high-rise tower, in 2017, 18 or whatever, near the top of the market in Vancouver, top of the condo market, and it's coming for completion this year. I mean, yeah, you're going to see a material loss, plus you tack on GST and all your taxes and then realtor fees but we're not really seeing a ton of it yet, and maybe in the odd building. But certainly not a lot of, buildings going up in flames or anything like that. So
we're bigger, Steve. We got to do it bigger.
Well, I think, but in Vancouver also doesn't have a lot of low-rise developments.
You mentioned that, right, Steve? The low-rise pre-con is not.
Not low-rise pre-con. Low-rise houses, which is what's going up in flames here.
Yes,
it's not condos going up in flames. It's single-family low-rise homes.
Is that what you guys are doing? People are lighting single families on. Yeah.
I mean, that's what's going.
Alleged.
That's what's going up in flames. I don't know why, but it's not condos. It's low-rise houses in the outer suburbs.
Yeah, and we don't build low-rise houses anymore. Single-family houses, we don't build new resale single families. It's not a thing anymore. You'll see townhouses and stuff like that, but I'd say a lot of those are still, for the most part, are still in the still in the green. But like I said, it just depends when you bought them, right? I mean, if you bought a townhouse pre-sale, then 2021 at the end of 21 into 22, and you're closing in 6 months, you're going to be underwater. But I wouldn't say there's a swath of product like that. So where we are seeing them is in some of these high-end condo towers that were pre-sold at ridiculous levels, and now seeing some big losses on those.
So that then leads me to the next thing. So obviously, seeing the pre-con sector in such trouble, we've already talked about starts being down, because why would you build in this environment? And if this type of activity continues, it, of course, in the longer term adds to the housing shortage gap, which leads us back to our, I guess, should it just be called federal government corner? The Trudeau housing corner. I just wanted to touch upon some housing file related activities that happened. So on October 31st, Marc Miller, the now new immigration minister, tabled an action plan for Canada's immigration system that will now, excuse me if I misspoke, Marc Miller is the Minister for Immigration. But he signaled that Canada would now take into account housing, healthcare, and infrastructure when setting immigration targets. What a good idea.
It makes you wonder what the heck they were doing before, but
absolutely.
Maybe they're watching the show.
Yeah, and that's what I said. I said to John, listen, this is vindication in a sense that people have been sounding this alarm. But as an average citizen, this is also very alarming, because you were always hoping these conversations would be taking place. Now, to be less facetious about it, it's actually extremely complicated in Canada to have this kind of a coordination, because a lot of those other things, housing, healthcare, infrastructure, fall under the provincial purview. So fine, maybe we'll give them that. But you would think that maybe a great canvassing of where the shortages are and what's happening would be taking place. I would have thought a review like that would have seen maybe an adjustment to the numbers that were then tabled in terms of the target for permanent residents, or maybe even some kind of statement like, listen, here's our target for 2025, and then we're going to wait and see on the other years. But no, on November 1st, the targets for 2024-26 were announced, and basically they're at the same levels, ramping up a bit to the 500,000 mark per year in 2025, and then again in 2026, where they indicate that's a plateau. So that was a really quick review overnight.
I mean, it's a little funny because he kind of framed that as the government's easing their targets, but that's actually an increase from where we are. But it's not the 500,000 permanent residents. Again, it's, the fact that on top of the 500,000 permanent residents that they're targeting, you have more than 500,000 non-permanent residents, which are students, which means our population's grown by over 1 million people per year. And yes, syncing up population growth with housing is very tricky, but you don't need a PhD to know that if you're growing by 1 million people per year and your country's only building 200,000 homes, your government's making a decision to crush housing affordability, because those numbers are ridiculous. So it's not that complicated. It's a decision. And this is a challenge I think I have with a lot of commentators that I follow and speak with. They all think it's just supply, you just reform zoning and you triple the number of homes you build. I mean, it's nonsense. I mean, this is idiotic. This is
we're going to find out.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. We'll find out. They've legalized housing in Toronto and in BC soon. So we'll see if housing completions triple. I mean, I'll bet the house that they don't. So it's really, the feds who are driving a lot of the price growth. I mean, there's just no way around it. And these numbers are going to weigh on affordability. And I think what we're probably going to see, and we didn't talk about it, is we're seeing stress in the rental market right now, which maybe we'll talk about next month. But that's, was that?
What kind of stress?
Well, just like stress from like a lot of like just affordability stress. You know what I mean? Because people who can't afford to buy, they're going to the rental market. There aren't a ton of rentals. Rentals, unlike house prices, are kind of more constrained by income. Like house prices, you can offset sort of that income math by just dropping down 300 grand cash for your down payment, right? From parents or whatever. But with rentals, it's very tied to household income. So anyhow, so this is going to continue to weigh, I think, on the market. I think the bigger effects right now are going to be interest rates, but when that's done, we're still going to have a housing crisis on our hands, even if prices dip a little bit.
Yeah, and I mean the financing of housing and projects is taking a big hit too. So it doesn't matter if you ease the rules, and fewer and fewer builders are able to take advantage of it, which is what we are seeing right now. Exactly. So I think we'll cover a little bit more depth, and I'll save it for a future session. Some of the unique ideas that are coming out of the city of Toronto in terms of trying to provide some of that financing to builders and other things, but that's for next time. This time, boys, we often put the politicians to task here. It is time for you two to be put to task, because a huge headline has come out specifically about residential real estates in the industry and the way that the industry earns money. The New York Times reporting, here's the headline: home sellers win a $1.8 billion decision after jury finds conspiracy amongst realtors. The influential U.S. National Association of Realtors and several brokerages were ordered to pay damages to home sellers who say they were forced to pay excessive fees to real estate agents. I think this is a big story. We're ending on a bang here for your industry. Am I right, John?
I think it's a big one. I mean, I don't know if you want me to kind of summarize what it's about.
Yeah, you tweeted about it. I think it would be helpful.
I mean, just at a high level, the industry in the US, the real estate industry, the National Association of Realtors, and a number of the big real estate brokers got sued because the argument is that because the big real estate associations, I mean, the issue is that the real estate associations force sellers effectively to compensate not just their agent, obviously, but also the buyer's agent, right? And these, the people kind of suing the real estate industry are arguing that it's like anti-competitive, it's kind of collusion, it's inflating commissions. Like, we as a seller should not have to pay the purchaser's agent. Let the buyer pay for their own real estate agent. And their argument is that this is basically inflating fees for the real estate industry. It's causing, real estate agents to steer their clients to the listings that have the higher commission on buyer agents. And I think we saw this. There's like a CBC Marketplace reporter, one of those kind of episodes that looked at how real estate agents steer their clients based on the commission on transactions. And they won that. And so, what happens from here, I think we don't know yet, but, I think there was a great article, I can't remember where the publication was, that talked about kind of what the worst case scenario for the real estate industry. And that would be if they basically banned or prevented the seller from compensating the buyer's agent in the future, right? So each agent would have to be compensated from their own client directly, because that would completely change the real estate industry, and then the compensation structure and all of that. So we'll see how that unfolds. There's a very similar case going on in Canada. So we don't know what's going to happen. I mean, at the end of the day, two of the big companies in the US, Remax and Anywhere, which are big kind of owners, they settled for way less than billions. I think it was like tens of millions of dollars. And part of their settlement was they had to cut ties with the National Association of Realtors, which is their big organization. So maybe it's just like a change that's not going to be that dramatic. We'll see. But at the end of the day, it's definitely making headlines in the US because they're usually years ahead of us. So what happens, and if you think about even like the fact that we have sold listings on websites like ours now and in Canada, that happened like 5 years earlier in the US. So usually what happens in the US is gives us some keys into what might happen up here in Canada.
You mean 5 years later?
Sorry, 5 years later up here. Yeah, they had it 5 years or more than 5 years earlier, I'd say.
So, John, can you help me clarify a few things? You testified for the Canadian government in, I forget the year, around that time, 5 years ago, to allow that to happen. In that case, it was an anti-competition case being brought against TREB, the Toronto Real Estate Board, and CREA, I think, was there, the Canadian Realtor Association, which is the Canadian equivalent of the American National Association of Realtors, was there as an observer. So in that case, it was the government going after them for antitrust. Was this a civil lawsuit in the United States?
I think it was. Yeah, I actually don't think it was like the federal government going after them, which is kind of interesting.
Yes, because they have wanted to for many years. We know that, and even when I think your firm and I was part of it was involved in the work around that, we knew that the Canadian federal government was very interested, the antitrust people, in commissions. So is the case in Canada an antitrust case, or is it another civil case?
I think it is civil. I don't think it's the federal government. I don't think it's the Competition Bureau going after them. I'm pretty sure. I mean, I haven't looked at it, but I don't think it's the Competition Bureau.
Right. And one wonders, though, does this give, feed the interest in going after it at a higher level or more consistent level? Steve, what are your thoughts? I'll give you the last word.
I don't really have any strong opinion, to be honest. I mean, I think in Vancouver, I think we have the lowest commissions in North America in terms of percentage. I mean, you'll often see, basically call it 3%. So, the US getting away with 6 or even 5 is.
So one sec. 3%. So as a seller's agent, you would charge your client 3% to sell their home.
So here's what I'll say. Okay. In my opinion, I know.
Forget you. Like on average.
Yes, I know, because we can't say there's an industry standard because that's against the rules. But what I'm going to say is basically, I'll give you an example. I charge 7% on the first 100,000 and 2.5% on the balance. 7 and 2.5, which in my opinion makes me sort of in line with where I see my competition. And so if I net that out, just keep it simple. It's basically just call it 3%. We tend to find that's basically split 55-45. So the buyer's agent will get about basically half of that. So yeah, it's basically a flat, let's call it 3%. Whereas I know like in the GTA is what, like 5 is kind of seemingly
4 to 5. Yeah, it depends on the.
Yeah, I do think like it's interesting talking to the Toronto guys, because I feel like in Vancouver, I think you kind of get what you pay for. Which I know, like, I know there's like people in Toronto that like will pay for staging and everything. Like that's not really common in Vancouver. It's like, okay, we'll kind of take care of the basic marketing and get this thing, moved, and it's a full service deal, but we're not, if you want to start doing staging and this and that, like that's usually on the seller to cover those additional costs.
Yeah, I think that's a big difference between your market and ours. Like, so I'd say maybe here 4% might be more common, split 2 and 2 is probably more 2.5%, 4%, 4.5%. But if you're charging 5% here, usually you're doing a lot more. I mean, we had a client here, we just paid for staging, paid for repairs, paid for a storage locker, paid for movers to take their stuff to the locker. Like you kind of like, it's like you project manage it. Like, because,
totally.
It's like, because people need to sell quickly. They don't have time. They're working and they're like, here are the keys, just take care of it. All they have to do is pack. Right. And it's like so you're spending like 10 grand on all this other stuff. So it's a little bit of a different.
Yeah, and you've almost become like a general contractor.
Yeah.
Well, kind of, or a project manager.
But
yeah,
at a risk, right, John? Like,
yeah,
because the agents in those cases are outlaying that amount.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's a bit different.
It's
100%.
like outlaying, and it's not guaranteed to sell.
No, and in a slowing
yeah.
market, it's interesting because in Toronto you see that kind of service offering almost pickup. And, the risk of that property being taken off the market, like you were saying, Steve, by somebody who wants to wait, is a high. The next agent that comes along and picks up that contract gets the benefit of the 10,000 that the last agent put into it.
So I'll make like two like jokes, but this is not like a joke. This is actually kind of like almost like inside, like, when I chat with, other realtors at our office, top producers, good friends of mine, things like that. Well, the two conversations we'll have today is, one is like, it's almost better to be the second agent in right now. So let the first guy list it overpriced and not sell for the first 3 months. And then hopefully you're the second guy in where the seller's sort of, been softened up a little bit, is actually more realistic about their pricing. So ideally to be second one in is always better in today's market. And then number 2 is like, yeah, hey, let's be honest. If you want to sell it, slapping a big realtor buyer's agent bonus on there in this kind of environment when some of these agents haven't been paid in 4 or 5 months, I'm not gonna lie, it makes a difference.
Yeah, I can.
So it is what it is. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying, hey, like if you came to me and said, Steve, I really want to sell this, I'd be like, to be honest, like, yes, there are buyer's agents that, in my opinion, aren't that good at their job and are more interested in looking out for their own best interests. And if they see a big realtor bonus on that, yeah, I do think there's a cohort of them that will steer their buyers towards that property.
Yeah.
I don't think that's controversial to say, Steve, the PreCon sector in Toronto, especially around condos, what do they do when there's a lot of projects and they need to up the sales? Those commissions for buyer agents just go up and up and up.
I'll comment on that one step further. So if you look at a lot of the luxury, like expensive condo pre-sales in Vancouver, for example, and I'm talking like, wow, like those are some huge numbers. Who's paying those? Like that doesn't really make a lot of sense. You go look at those commission structures and they're I mean, in a lot of cases, they're double. They're double what you'd get on like a resale or a very basic standard pre-sale unit. Mm-hmm. So, anyways, it is what it is. So like I said, I think buyer beware, caveat emptor. I think, obviously who you hire matters. And I'm sure John and I will agree on that.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good note to end on. I thank both of you. This is, this is a difficult month. And for a lot of people. I know, John, you were battling a cold, so thank you for staying with us. And Steve, you legend over there. You started in a phone booth, you ended in a phone booth.
Oh, and he's coming to Toronto in a couple of weeks too.
Is he? Yes. Yes, everybody. We will put a link in our show notes. Well, I think you're sold out though. So you can only
not yet. You know what's funny with the Looney Hours joking? We said, man, the recession must be biting hard in Toronto.
No, people just don't know yet. Okay, so Steve and his fabulous colleagues at the podcast, The Looney Hour, are coming to Toronto. We're going to throw that into the show notes. Sign up. It's a great night. I hope I'm able to come, Steve. Are you saving a seat?
We can. We have our holiday party that night, so we're not going to.
Oh no, Steve! The coordination on this.
You're part of the problem.
I know. We are.
This is terrible. Okay, so but for all of you consumers, you will love this. So we'll put this in our show notes. And thank you both, and thank you to our audience. Next week, keep your comments coming. We're at Move Smartly on Twitter. John is at John Pasalis. Steve is at Steve Saretsky. And, email us. Let us know what you'd like to hear. Email, text, whatever. Let us know what you'd like to hear more about. And hopefully you will find this useful. So thank you both. And thanks to all of you listening and watching.